The forgotten basement. Mark had always been fascinated by urban exploration. The thrill of discovering abandoned places, forgotten by time, was intoxicating. But nothing could have prepared him for what he found in the basement of the old Blackwood Asylum. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, its dark history of unethical experiments and patient abuse buried along with its reputation. Mark had heard rumors of secret underground levels, and he was determined to find them. Armed with his flashlight and camera, Mark squeezed through a broken window and made his way inside. The air was thick with dust and decay, and the silence was oppressive. As he explored the crumbling halls, he found a hidden door behind a fallen bookcase. His heart racing with excitement, Mark pried open the door, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The stairs creaked ominously under his weight as he made his way down, the beam of his flashlight barely penetrating the inky blackness. The basement was a maze of corridors and locked doors. Mark's excitement turned to unease as he noticed strange symbols carved into the walls, their meanings lost to time. The air grew colder, and Mark could have sworn he heard whispers echoing from deep within the labyrinth. As he turned a corner, his flashlight illuminated a sight that made his blood run cold. A room filled with rusted metal tables, each bearing the unmistakable stains of old blood. Surgical instruments lay scattered about, their edges still sharp despite years of neglect. Mark's hands shook as he raised his camera to document the gruesome scene. But as he looked through the viewfinder, he saw something that wasn't there before, a figure standing in the corner of the room. He lowered the camera, but the corner was empty. Chalking it up to his imagination, Mark continued deeper into the basement. The whispers grew louder, and he could almost make out words, pleas for help, screams of agony. In the next room, Mark found rows of cells, their doors hanging off rusted hinges. Each cell contained a single bed and what looked like restraints. The walls were covered in frantic scratches and scrawled messages, "Help us, they're coming, no escape." As Mark read the desperate words, a cold hand gripped his shoulder. He spun around, but there was no one there. His flashlight flickered, and in that moment of darkness, he saw them, ghostly figures filling the room, their eyes hollow and accusing. Mark ran, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear footsteps behind him, getting closer no matter how fast he ran. The whispers turned to screams, filling his head with the agonized cries of countless tortured souls. He burst through a door and found himself in a circular room. In the center stood a strange machine, its purpose unimaginable. Old film reels lay scattered around, and without thinking, Mark grabbed one. As he turned to leave, his flashlight died. In the pitch darkness, Mark felt cold hands grabbing at him, pulling him towards the machine. He struggled, screaming for help that would never come. Suddenly, a bright light filled the room. Mark found himself strapped to one of the metal tables, surrounded by shadowy figures and doctors' coats. One leaned over him, its face a horrifying blend of human and something else. "Welcome," it hissed, "to your new home." Mark's screams echoed through the empty asylum, but no one was there to hear them. Months later, a new urban explorer found her way into the Blackwood Asylum's basement. As she explored, she came across a dusty camera and a collection of film reels. Curious, she picked up one of the reels and held it to the light. What she saw made her drop the reel in horror. It was footage of a man, Mark, strapped to a table, undergoing unspeakable procedures. His eyes were wide with terror as shadowy figures moved around him, wielding strange instruments. The explorer ran, leaving the camera and films behind. But the images stayed with her, haunting her dreams. She could never shake the feeling that somewhere in that dark basement, Mark was still there, trapped between worlds, his suffering eternal. The Blackwood Asylum still stands, its secrets hidden in the forgotten basement. Those who venture too close claim to hear whispers on the wind, warnings, pleas for help, and the agonized screams of a man named Mark, forever lost in the darkness. The Midnight Shift. Detective Sarah Reeves had seen her fair share of gruesome crime scenes, but nothing prepared her for the horrors that awaited her at the Oakwood funeral home. It was just past midnight when the call came in: multiple homicides, possible ritual killings. As Sarah pulled up to the Victorian-style building, a sense of unease settled over her. The funeral home's windows were dark, save for a flickering light in the basement. Officer Jenkins greeted her at the door, his face pale. "You're not gonna believe this, detective," he said, leading her inside. The interior was a scene of carnage. Bodies lay strewn across the floor, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. But it was the state of the corpses that made Sarah's stomach churn. They had been dissected with surgical precision, organs removed and arranged in bizarre patterns on the floor. "Where's the owner?" Sarah asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "That's the thing," Jenkins replied. "Mr. Carver's nowhere to be found. But we found this in his office." He handed Sarah a leather-bound book. As she flipped through it, her eyes widened. The pages were filled with arcane symbols and detailed instructions for dark rituals, all written in what appeared to be blood. A noise from the basement made them both jump. Sarah drew her gun, motioning for Jenkins to follow. As they descended the stairs, the air grew thick with the smell of decay and something else, something sulfurous. The basement was a maze of storage rooms and embalming chambers. In the central room, they found an altar made of bones and surrounded by candles. Fresh blood dripped from its surface. "What the hell was Carver into?" Jenkins whispered. Before Sarah could respond, a low chanting filled the air. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The candles flickered, and shadows danced on the walls, taking on monstrous shapes. Suddenly, the corpses from upstairs began to shuffle into the room, their movements jerky and unnatural. Sarah fired her gun, but the bullets passed through them harmlessly. "Run," she yelled to Jenkins, but he stood frozen in terror. The chanting grew louder, and Sarah watched in horror as Jenkins' body began to contort. His skin bubbled and stretched, his screams turning into inhuman howls. Sarah ran, slamming doors behind her, the sound of shuffling corpses and Jenkins' howls close behind. She burst out of the funeral home, gasping for air. As she turned back, she saw Mr. Carver in the doorway, his eyes glowing with an unearthly light. He smiled, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "Thank you for the fresh sacrifices, detective," he said, his voice layered with other, darker tones. "They were just what we needed." The door slammed shut, and Sarah was left alone in the night, the sounds of unholy rituals echoing from within the funeral home. In the days that followed, the Oakwood Funeral Home burned to the ground in an unexplained fire. The bodies were never recovered. Sarah quit the force, but the memories haunted her. And on quiet nights, she could still hear the chanting, calling her back to finish what had begun. The last broadcast. The old radio tower stood like a skeletal finger pointing accusingly at the sky. For years, it had been broadcasting nothing but static, a relic of a bygone era. But tonight, something was different. Jack Chen, a local tech enthusiast, had picked up a strange signal emanating from the tower. Intrigued, he decided to investigate, unaware that he was about to stumble upon a horror beyond imagination. As Jack approached the tower, his radio crackled to life. Through the static, he could make out a voice, faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. "Help, they're coming, don't let them in." The message repeated, growing more frantic with each iteration. Jack's curiosity turned to concern. Was someone trapped in the old broadcast room? The door to the tower creaked open at his touch. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with the scent of rusted metal. Jack climbed the spiral staircase, his flashlight beam dancing across graffitied walls. The broadcast room was a mess of outdated equipment and scattered papers. In the center stood an old microphone, covered in a thick layer of dust. But as Jack watched, the dust seemed to shift, as if someone had just been speaking into it. Suddenly, the radio in his hand erupted in a burst of static, making him jump. When the noise subsided, a new voice came through, deep, guttural, and definitely not human. "We've been waiting for you, Jack," it growled. The door slammed shut behind him. Jack spun around, his heart pounding. The room seemed to stretch and distort, the walls pulsing like a living thing. From the shadows, figures began to emerge. They were vaguely humanoid, but wrong, limbs too long, faces twisted into impossible angles. Their eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. "What are you?" Jack gasped. The creature nearest to him grinned, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. "We are the voices in the static," it hissed. "The whispers between frequencies. And now, you will join our broadcast." Jack tried to run, but the creatures were faster. They surrounded him, their cold hands grasping at his flesh. He felt a pulling sensation, as if his very essence was being torn from his body. In a flash of blinding light, Jack found himself elsewhere. He was formless, a consciousness floating in an endless void of radio waves and electromagnetic radiation. He could sense others around him, countless souls trapped in this broadcasting purgatory. Their voices merged with his, becoming part of the eternal static. Back in the physical world, Jack's body collapsed, empty and lifeless. The creatures retreated to the shadows, their task complete. Days later, when Jack was reported missing, the police searched the tower. They found nothing but an old radio, softly playing static. But if one listened closely, they might hear a familiar voice hidden in the white noise, eternally calling for help. The old radio tower still stands, broadcasting its eerie signal. And sometimes, on quiet nights, locals swear they can hear voices in the static, pleading, warning, and calling out to unsuspecting listeners, luring them to join the last broadcast.